Welcome to Grief Chats with Dana and Mira, where we talk candidly about all things grief and widowhood. Grief is hard. Let's talk about it.
Even more awkward than last week somehow.
We keep saying it's going to get easier. Maybe it's not. Maybe like grief, it actually doesn't get easier.
Unless you have a really good idea of a way to start it, because I don't.
No. We're winging it completely. So.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Grief Chat. Today is our second episode, and we're going to be talking about general tips around grief literacy, and also the way that the society that we live in tends to be quite grief illiterate or grief averse, and how that affects us as grievers and as survivors of traumatic loss. So just a sort of general thing to say at the beginning, I find that it's really important when we have these conversations about grief literacy and grief illiteracy that we say, this is not about pointing fingers. This is not about sort of saying, you know, you did this and it didn't make me feel good, and therefore you don't know anything about how to support someone. It's not about that at all. For me, and I don't know, Dana, maybe you can add on if you agree. I feel like for me, it's about us all understanding that we live in a society where we just have not ever been taught what to say about hard things, about grief, about loss. We were never taught that. We don't have a lot of role models of people around us who are very comfortable talking about death, dying, especially traumatic death, grief. And so none of us know. We don't have the tools, and it's by no fault of our own. It's because we just haven't had the opportunities to learn. But I think that it can create this sort of vicious cycle, because then when you go through a really traumatic loss like we have, all of a sudden you're in the situation where you're like, oh my God, I had literally no training for this. I had no idea what this was going to be like. And now everybody around me has no concept of what this is like. And I feel so alone and so isolated. And it's really difficult when you are then in that state of hurting so much and being in so much pain to then all of a sudden be expected to sort of lead the way and teach everybody around you about grief. And I often thought to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful if there is sort of just a little bit of a general greater understanding of grief and loss and what it's actually like, and how much that would serve all of us when we go through hard things, because it is inevitable that we will all continue to go through hard things. And how awesome would it be if we all had a little more comfort level, a little bit more of just a baseline general knowledge. And it's not about, always knowing exactly what to say or having all the answers. It's about understanding this is a topic worth talking about, and that people's lived experiences are worth listening to without getting your back up or getting defensive or feeling like it's a failure. And just all of us generally like being more comfortable talking about death, because it's such a huge part of life, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. And I think it's like any difficult topic, it's trying to figure out how do you have conversations around something that's uncomfortable. And for us personally, it's surrounding grief and loss and death. But I think our natural tendency, or at least mine is to get defensive if, a lot of what we're going to talk about, we've made those mistakes. And I know in the past that I would get defensive. If I hear someone saying and feeling like I'm being called out for something I did that maybe wasn't helpful, my reaction is to attack, kind of go into attack mode and defense mode. And I think if you're listening and you're here to try and educate yourself and help somebody who maybe is grieving, or to learn for, the future, to prepare yourself, just keep in mind, as Mira said, we're not pointing fingers. We've made these mistakes. Try not to get defensive and really come from a place of learning and understanding that we are talking about this as a way to educate and help, move these conversations forward in a way that's helpful and not meant to attack or harm anyone. Mm-hmm. And that can be difficult to remember sometimes.
Definitely. And I agree. I would have been exactly the same before. And the tricky thing when it comes to grief and death is that there is no one right thing to say. So you literally will always feel like a failure to some extent, because like, just because you've gotten to know exactly what I want in grief, it doesn't mean that's the exact same thing that the next person that you know who goes through something really hard is going to want from you. So it's just more about having this ability to be sort of reflective and not get your back up and just listen and be comfortable having the hard conversations. And that's, I think, kind of what Grief Chats is all about.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so to start, we are going to talk about specific examples that have happened in our lives where we have met up with this general grief illiteracy, how it made us feel, what the impact was on us as grievers, and then we're going to kind of get into just some general tips at the end about kind of what you can say that tends to be a good thing for most grievers, what you shouldn't say, and then just some tips and takeaways. So hopefully that will be really helpful as well. So I'm going to start by sharing an example of a situation that I went through around the 1 year mark after Brian's death. And I think this is a cool example to share because it's actually the inspiration for why Dana and I wanted to start Grief Chat. So I had this experience. It was around the 1 year mark. Dana and I had just recently sort of started really connecting online and chatting. And I shared the experience with her. And she was like, I remember your reaction. You were like, I'm so proud of you for saying something. I remember that. And I appreciated that so much because I was like, feeling so shitty about myself that I had made such a big deal out of it. And I remember that reaction from you. And I was like, it's true. You know, I actually said something, and that is a good thing, because it often feels like it's not, because then it makes people uncomfortable. And then, you know,
Oh, yeah.
we're kind of trained that we should just say things that make people feel good. Right. So,
right. I know. And I think I was, if you were I was 3 years out and still struggling with actually standing up and saying these things to someone that unintentionally hurt me. And so I remember that, and you posting about it and being so open and truly just feeling proud. And I was just like, oh my gosh, here's this person owning this and actually said something to the person, not just getting on the internet and being like, oh my God, fellow widows, like you actually had a conversation. And I just admire that so much. So I'm so excited that it led to this and all of these conversations that we're going to have.
Right. So this was actually the inspiration. So then we started DMing, and then we were initially just going to do a live, and then we were like, let's just make it a series. We got a lot to talk about. So that's how it all started. So it was a horrible situation at the time. But now I'm kind of glad it happened in a way. So it involves a friend of mine who's also a neighbor. And she's not a super, super good friend. She's somebody who, I used to love spending time with. She's very, very kind and nice. And we always had a good time just sort of chit-chatting about stuff. And I always kind of had this sense from her that she wasn't very comfortable with anything kind of dark or hard. And when Brian died, that became very apparent. Like she was, anytime I would run into her, because we're neighbors, she would just be making small talk. And I really couldn't handle it, and had a very strong gut feeling, especially for the first year after Brian's death, where I just couldn't handle small talk. And I didn't really have space to interact with people, and socializing actually was really triggering for me, unless it was like somebody really focusing on me and my grief. Like I really couldn't just sort of chit chat about general life stuff. That was very difficult for me, and still is to a certain extent, but especially at the beginning. And so with this particular friend, it wasn't really lining up right. I wasn't into spending a lot of time with her. And she kept inviting me over a lot and wanting me to come over and trying to be really kind. And I just sort of politely declined the offers and was like, thank you so much, but I'm really still not really up for socializing, which was totally true. Mm-hmm. And then around the 1 year mark, I was walking down the street and I bumped into her with a mutual acquaintance of ours. And this mutual acquaintance was somebody who I really don't know very well at all. I would just see her at dinner parties that this mutual friend of ours would host. But the last time that I saw her was at this really lovely dinner party the December before Brian started feeling sick. And so everything was totally normal, but it was right before he got sick. And we were like, oh, see you soon. We're going to have another dinner party in the new year. It's so great to be getting to know you. And then Brian got sick and died, and I didn't see her at all. So this was the first time I've seen her since this dinner party, this acquaintance. And it was super awkward. She didn't acknowledge anything about my loss. She was just like obviously so uncomfortable around me. She started making small talk about the kids, and it was making me feel like sick to my stomach. And I just felt so sad and kind of made an excuse and just kind of got out of the situation pretty quickly. And then a couple days later, I ran into this friend of mine, and she was like, hey, again, just trying to be super friendly, was like, hey, I just wanted to let you know, like the other day when you saw me with our mutual acquaintance, and we really wanted to hang out with you. We wanted to spend time with you. You didn't have to run away like that. Like, you're welcome to spend time with us. Like, just really trying to, again, be so nice and welcoming of me. And I was just like, it was a moment when I was kind of like, okay, this is a situation where I could say something or I could not say something. And for some reason, I was like, I'm going to say something. And I took a breath and I was just like, actually, thanks so much. But the reason why I left that situation so quickly, the reason why I kind of disappeared was because this acquaintance of ours, she didn't mention my loss. I haven't seen her since that dinner party you guys had right before Brian got sick. And she didn't say anything. And I find that really hurtful because to me, it feels like she's not acknowledging this huge thing that's happened to me. It feels like she's not honoring his life and this huge loss in my life. And I just feel like it doesn't feel right to have like a normal social interaction after that. And my friend got super defensive, very defensive, and started, trying to stick up for this other friend who's a much closer friend of hers, and was like, well, obviously, Mira, she's not going to just start, talking about Brian. Like, what if you're having a good day and it's going to make you feel sad? And, what if you weren't thinking about him? And then all of a sudden she brings him up and it makes you upset. Like, obviously she's not going to bring him up. If you want to bring him up, you bring him up. And I was like, actually, that's one of the most common misconceptions in grief. And from what I have seen and the people that I've connected with, for most of us, actually acknowledging our loss and acknowledging our person is what we want. And just so you know, like, there's never a day doesn't pass, a moment doesn't pass when I'm not thinking, like, this was only a year out. I was constantly thinking about Brian.
Right.
Yeah. Right. And I was like, you're not going to remind me of it. The second I see somebody who I haven't seen in a long time, my mind immediately goes to, oh my God, I haven't seen them since before Brian died. Oh my God, are they going to say something? Are they not going to say something? Like, before they've said anything, that's what's going through my mind, right? So it's not like it's going to remind me. Like, it was just so, I couldn't believe it. Like, I was just like, oh wow, Anyways, so then she started getting upset with me. And all this stuff came out of how she was feeling so rejected by me. So she says, Mira, I've tried so hard since Brian died. I've tried to invite you over. You're not taking any of these offers. And, you're not the only one who's experienced grief. You're not the only one who's experienced suffering. So right then and there, I'm like, okay, this really sounds like the sort of all lives matter type of sentiment. Like, here, I'm stating my needs as a griever. This is my loss. And you're then trying to pretend that we're all on the same page and that I have no right to state these things that I need because everybody suffers and everybody grieves, which is
making you feel guilty for how you feel.
Exactly. And like, what are you supposed to say to that? There's no response. Yes, of course, everybody suffers and everybody grieves. Like, that's true, And backstory on this particular person is that I know for a fact that she sustained a very horrible loss when she was a child. And I know that it was never acknowledged, it was never talked about, and her grief and everything was really swept under the rug. And so when I talked about this with my therapist, and this was kind of my inclination as well, was that likely sort of me stating my needs of my wounded heart is then triggering to her because her wounds were never tended to. Yeah. And so the reason I think this is really interesting when we're talking about a grief illiterate society is that she herself is also a victim to this grief illiterate society, right? Her grief was never tended to, was never cared for, was never respected. And so therefore it's too much for her to even consider mine. And it's so complicated. There's so many layers there, but it just shows you how these cycles repeat themselves over and over and over, right? It's this vicious cycle that continues over and over. Essentially, when she said that, all of us suffer. I said, to be honest, that's why I haven't said yes to any of your wonderful offers to hang out, is because I'm really not capable of this type of conversation right now. And I just really need my grief to be acknowledged. It's a huge part of my life right now, and I need that to be acknowledged. And I remember the final statement was, she said, I'm not going to be like a bull in a china shop, just coming into your life and all of a sudden asking you all of these questions about grief or making it all about your grief. And I was like, I remember thinking it's so interesting that she thinks of that as being a bull in a china shop, like coming in and asking all these questions. I was like, my life is no longer a china shop. My life is not a china. It's like my life is the bull, essentially. Like I am living the bull.
Right. That's banging around everything else in your life.
Yeah, like it's not like I have this perfect life that you coming in and asking me about my grief or asking me about Brian is gonna like blow it all up. It's already been blown up. And this is the main thing is, for me, like one of the really big points of grief literacy is just that we all just need to become more comfortable understanding that grief is a part of life and not avoiding it so much, and not thinking that by asking someone about their grief, you're being a bull in a china shop. Right?
That's so interesting that in her mind, it is such an intrusion. That's such a like visual way of saying that, where she feels like she's coming in and just destroying everything around you by asking about your grief, by asking about your loss. And it's, how do you respond to that? I feel like it's hard to have a conversation.
I think it is different going through a loss as a child and having it be unacknowledged and not having it be a safe thing to talk about. I think that is extremely different than being an adult and being able to sort of find your own way the way that we have,
You're so right, because it does require somebody else, and not that we don't require as adults other people to help guide us through this, and therapists and other conversations, but as a child, you are reliant completely on somebody to take you through and show you how you're supposed to respond or what you're supposed to feel and what's okay to feel.
What's
and you
allowed.
don't have the tools.
Yeah. Like kids are constantly just looking to their parents for what is accepted, what's allowed here, because they have no idea. It's like, I don't know, is this okay? Is that okay? Is that like, my daughter is constantly like that. She's like doing something. She's like, is this okay? It's just, they're learning. They're just learning. Or she's trying to do something and she kind of knows it's not right. And she's looking at me for approval, like out of the corner of her eye, Kids are just always doing that. So I think that is a big part of the picture. But, yeah, it was really hard. Like now it's one of those stories where I can look back and I'm like, oh, it's so obvious, right? What's going on? And even though I kind of knew that at the time, it was so hard because I was feeling so deflated already. It was right after the pandemic had started. I just passed the 1 year mark, which is such a hard point because you're like, oh, the year's over. Oh,
I still feel terrible.
And now it's a pandemic. And that was just a really bad interaction. It really set me over the edge into a bad phase of grief. And I think that it's just interesting to just show how, of course, it wasn't my friend's fault that I was grieving. Like clearly I'm grieving because Brian died. I'm not going to be happy and carefree regardless. But this was a situation that could have been avoided and would have really saved me an extra burden on top of what's already hard. So I think grief literacy and building grief literacy, it doesn't take away the pain at all, but it somehow makes it easier to bear in community of people who are like open and willing and supportive. That's kind of my dream.
Yeah, you feel cared for and held, even if you're having a conversation with somebody who has not experienced what you've experienced. I think having somebody that can truly sit and listen with you and not get defensive because they didn't respond in the way that you needed, which how would they know? That's okay. But instead of getting defensive, really just asking questions, wanting to know why you felt that way, being comfortable not knowing and having that dialogue. And I think that's why it's so important. These conversations aren't for the answers. We don't have the answers. It really is, let's get comfortable not knowing. Let's get comfortable asking questions. Let's get comfortable saying the wrong thing. Like be comfortable in all of it because we all are trying to navigate this and we're all different in how we navigate it.
Yeah,
So it's such
absolutely.
an incredible example of grief on top of grief and the burden and so many complicated layers.
Yeah. And at the time, even I remember feeling so much compassion for her because, especially with the way that she was responding to me with so much emotion, I could
Mhm.
tell that something about what I was saying was triggering her a
Yeah.
lot. And I could really, even though I was in such intense, deep grief myself at the time, and it was really hard, I remember acknowledging that, you
Mhm.
know? And I remember it's really what started me being like, we need more grief literacy. We just need, like, the fact that she just could have, just so misinterpreted the situation so much. It just boggled my mind,
Right.
Like, it was like the things I was saying to her were completely out of left field. And I just wish those things weren't completely out of left field, you know? But I
Right.
wish there was a little more like, oh yeah, I had heard that maybe some grievers wanted that. Even that would be a huge improvement
Right.
from where we are now.
Right. Right. I have a lot of examples from acquaintances and similar situations of people that don't really know me and make it hard to say the right thing. And there's one thing that kept coming up for me that is a lot more personal, and it was an interaction with somebody who um, was very supportive and is very supportive of my grief and was by my side through it and still said something that was really offensive to me. And it was my brother-in-law, who's Brad's twin brother. So, I mean, the closest person was in the womb with him, is grieving alongside these parallel journeys that are also very different. And some point within probably about a year in, or some point in that first year, he said to me um, that I will be able to find another husband and he'll never be able to get another brother or have another twin. And I just remember being so hurt, and I did not say anything because I didn't know how to respond. And the truth is it is a fact. It is a factual statement that I I do have the ability to find another husband, to get remarried, to do all of this, and he does not have that same thing. But by bringing this up to me in the way that he did, I feel like, first of all, it was comparing grief, which is so difficult. And I think we've all done it, and we're all guilty of, like, I'm grieving more. It was this competitive, like, who has it worse? And this is a person who, like, we are so close, and Brad and him had a great relationship, and I'm very close with his family. But in that moment, it just felt like my grief wasn't as important as his. And the second thing I feel like it did was it made it feel like Brad was replaceable for me. That it was this title and this role of husband, which yes, the title and role are replaceable, but Brad is not. Like, even if there's another love, even if there's another marriage, Brad is irreplaceable for me. And this has now happened. It was 3 years ago, and it still hurts. And I think about the idea of falling in love and having another relationship, and that still is, like, in the back of my head of, is he going to think that Brad is less on my heart, and less a part of me because I'm doing exactly what he said I could do? And it's unfair. And we've had a conversation about it since, and only very recently, because we've been talking about this, and I wanted to come up with an example that's actually difficult to share about, because this person was my number one grief support, and 99.9% of the time said the right thing and knew how to support me even while he was grieving and sad and angry and all of the things. And I think the example is just so powerful because it is something that, even when you love this person and support them, we still say the wrong thing because we are angry and sad and on our own grief path, that we will say things because we're pissed. And there was no point. I don't think he was trying to hurt me. He was just mad that his twin brother died,
Yeah.
and trying to somehow, like, grapple with what that means for him and how that compares to what it means for me. And in my mind, I immediately got defensive, which is, we've talked about, where it's like, he's every day, like, every part of my day is different. Like, from the second I wake up, he's not there, and trying to, again, go back to comparing griefs, which isn't helpful at all, but that's because I couldn't have that conversation with him then. That's where I went in my mind and got angry, and instead of coming together and having that conversation, it was, I'm now going to come over here and be pissed at you. It is hard to be like, hey, you hurt me. It's why when you talked about it, on what your friend said, I was like, that is so hard because it's going to be difficult to do. And so I was proud of myself for doing it, but it was not easy. It was not easy. And I think we are better because of it. But
yeah,
3 years. It literally took 3 years to bring it up, out of that moment.
And there are definitely moments within my grief where people have said things that I have not still, there's definitely things like that are there in there somewhere that I'm like, I don't have the space or energy yet. When you're in really deep grief at the beginning, it's so hard to have those conversations. Like what you said, oh my gosh, like of course you had to wait until now to have that conversation, because it's so hard when you're in that early stage of grief. It's just to have those types, to put yourself out there like that, to any more opportunity for wounding or hurt is just impossible, right? You're in so much pain. And, with this friend of mine, I remember sharing it and being like, that was exhausting. Okay, so the number one thing not to say is, I can't even imagine, like as in, I can't even imagine what this is like for you. And I would have never in a million years guessed that this is a bad thing to say. I used to say it all the time. For sure. I still find myself tempted to say it. I'm sure I have said it even since Brian died, but I'm now trying to stop myself. But it's hard because it's very ingrained. And the reason that this tends to feel bad for a lot of grievers, and this is a very common one, is it makes us feel like there is this wall between us and you, and we are on one side and you are on the other side. And even thinking about what we've been through, even imagining it, is so painful for you. You can't even do that. And here we are living it, and it just makes us feel very unseen and very alone.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's you can imagine for a second. Your brain can go there. You just don't want to.
Yeah.
So number one. Okay, so the second one is, did he smoke? Did he have health issues? Did he
drink cider?
Did he
sometimes
beer? Yes. Did she do X? And for me, and I had somebody say this, and they found out Brad died of cancer. They were like, well, did he smoke? And I was just like, and I wrote a whole blog post on it after because I was so mad. Because I was like, does that make it okay that he's dead at 35 years old because he smoked? Like, does that mean, was just so upset. And it's like, it doesn't matter what he did. Like, it's not Brad's fault he died. Like, we all could make better decisions. It's not helpful for the griever, even if that was the direct cause of his death. I'm like, you are saying this to his widow. Like, this isn't helpful. And really, I think what this person is doing is protecting themselves to be like, if I know what he did personally, I can be like, oh, great, I don't do that, check. I don't have to worry about my mortality. Like, I can now go back to my life where I don't have to worry about dying at a young age because I didn't do whatever that was. And again, I think so much of what people say, it's because they don't know how to handle that kind of loss. And so it's a protection defense mechanism, and they don't really understand how that lands and is not just offensive, but infuriating to someone who is on the other side experiencing and living that loss.
For sure. To even imply or say anything like that is just stirring up fire in an already impossible situation.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you're right. I think it's a separation tactic of, I'm safe from this. And again, like the first one, even, it's like there's a wall and I'm on this side and you're on that side. And it all comes back to being uncomfortable with sitting in hard stuff.
Yes, exactly.
They need to separate themselves from you.
Right.
It's
how they get through it without having to put themselves in your shoes. There is this purposeful, even if it's subconscious, but it is this separation. And you're right.
Yeah, it totally could be subconscious. Exactly. But again, just our general discomfort with death, with cancer, with grief,
especially at a young age. So
exactly. Okay, so number 3 of what not to say is comparisons, but more specifically comparing the loss to another kind of loss. Like, for example, comparing someone losing their spouse to the loss of a grandparent, or even worse, a breakup. So like saying something like, my grandfather died, so I understand what you're going through. And just number 1, you should never compare grief or loss. They're not comparable. Each situation is unique. But secondly, that just really sort of to, I think, make it into something that feels more palatable or more acceptable because it's so uncomfortable.
I'm imagining that it's coming from a place of, I'm trying to connect with your pain based on my worst pain. And they don't always mesh, but it's like, I think oftentimes it's coming from, I'm trying to share my pain so that we can be on the same level and I can connect and understand better. And the intention is great. Like, I completely understand that. Like, you and I sitting here, we can have a conversation about the similarities of our loss because we have been through it enough. I think early in grief, when someone has just experienced a loss, this is when this is really dangerous to be like those immediate, like, I know how you feel because of X, that's not the same. And even if it's the same, even if it's me saying it to you 2 weeks after Brian died, like, you're going to be like, fuck you. You have no idea how I feel. And I don't. We're different people. We handle it differently. And so I think that like desire to connect is there and the intention is good, but just be so careful as to if you use this and compare in any capacity, how it cross and at what point, and don't do it early on. Like, don't do it.
That's such a good point about the early on thing. That's such a good point, because I remember being early on and even like reading other things other widows had written and being like, you don't understand. Like, you clearly don't understand the extent of this pain. And anyone comparing or relating to me in any way about any other kind of death or loss, I was just like, get out of my face. I can't handle this, anything. Whereas now it is easier for me to be like, to have conversations with somebody who's like, dad died, for example, and be like, okay, this isn't super triggering to me. I can understand there are certain similarities between our losses, and like, you do understand grief, and it's easier for me now, for sure.
Right. Okay, number 4, what not to say. Anything that starts with at least. I feel like I've talked about this so much, and it's what bothers me the most. The at least you're young and can't get married again, or to somebody older that maybe spent a lifetime. At least you're old and you had your lifetime together. At least he died really quickly and so he didn't suffer, or at least he had a very slow death so you had time to say goodbye. It's like all of these at least that try and put a silver lining in your grief is not helpful. Like, none of it comforts the griever. Like, it just is like, I don't care that I'm young and can marry again. I'm devastated. I don't care that I had a chance to say goodbye. Like, it wasn't enough time. There's no matter what. If I've talked to people that are 80 years old and had 50 years and they're still devastated, and it's not helpful for the griever to say it, unless it's at least I'm at your door with tequila and cakes and here you go. Like, then go for it. But it's got to be a really good at least.
Yeah, and I think for me, when I hear that comment, it makes me feel like it's a way they're trying, whether it's conscious or unconscious, it's a way that they're trying to silence my grief. So, if I'm saying something like, this is really hard for me, or I feel this way, or I'm feeling really upset, or this or that, it's like, well, at least this, or at least that. It makes me feel like that's a whole silver lining thing. And, just look on the bright side. And it makes me feel like it's not safe for me to talk about my grief. Like, I shouldn't be talking about my grief. I need to always put a bow on top or turn it into something positive. And that's not actually helpful when you're actually grieving, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so number 5 is, the queen of all platitudes, which is, he's in a better place.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I've ever met, like, with a lot of these, like even with I can't imagine, there are exceptions. There's always the odd person who's like, actually, that did make me feel good. You know, I've never heard anyone say he's in a better place made them feel good.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't even know what else to say. Just don't. I have not personally met anyone who's like, yes, I felt better when someone else said that to me. Like, so I would avoid it.
Yeah, especially in early grief, which is when a lot of the cards come with the platitudes on them. Like I specifically remember getting a card in the mail like 2 days after Brian died that was like, he's in a better place or something like that. And I was just like, I want to burn
this card.
Any idea what suffering is like? He went through so much. None of this was in any way meant to be, he should be here with us healthy. That's where he should be, you know? Like, oh. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Number 6. Let me know if you need anything. And this is the one that is said all the time. I've said it a million times. I think it's being nice and thoughtful. I'm here. Let me know if you need anything. Why this is troubling is because it puts the responsibility back on the griever to, one, know what it is that they need, which especially early in grief, you have no idea what you need. And then 2, you are forcing them to go back to you when they figure out what they need and ask for it. That's a lot to put on the griever. And it's just not helpful. And I think about like the Facebook messages, like that's what's like all over Facebook. And I'm like, am I supposed to go back and like find who said this and then be like, did they mean it? Did they can I go back? Like, it's just, I feel like it's a useless platitude that carries no positive weight, even though, again, the intention is good.
Right.
It's not actually helpful.
And I was like, there's nothing I could ask for because there's nothing that could make me feel better. Like, I didn't want to eat. I'm not going to ask for food. But if someone dropped me off something they made, I might eat some, but I'm not going to be like, oh, you know what? I really need this list of groceries. Can you go get this for me? I was like in such a state I couldn't even think of what I wanted. There was nothing I wanted. I didn't want anything, you know? Right. Yeah, that's a bad one. And so common.
It's so common. It's so common. And again, like most of these, it's like we've all done it. They are common. We're not trying to attack anyone, but just to be more aware.
This is how it lands. This is how it lands to someone who's been through something really hard, actually.
Right, exactly. Okay, you want to start with number 1 thing that you can say?
So number 1 of things that you can say is, I don't know what to say, but I'm here with you and I'm not going anywhere. And then sort of the follow-up thing is that you actually do follow through on that. Mm-hmm. So you actually stay around and you actually keep checking in and you actually keep showing up. So you don't just say that, you actually follow through. But I think this is a really, really beautiful one because it acknowledges right off the bat that none of us know what to say. Yeah. We're all new at this. We're all just trying, and that we're still here for it and here for the discomfort of it, and that you really mean it, you know?
Yeah, totally. And I think you're right. The follow through for this one is the most important part. Like, make sure you actually are showing up and there. Yeah. Okay. So the second one is kind of in the same vein. It, again, just being honest and saying something along the lines of, this is total shit. Like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. The simple apology and acknowledgement of the shit situation you're in, I think is more powerful than a fake platitude or a false offering to do something that you're not going to follow through with. So I think it's a really safe and easy thing to say to somebody and have them feel seen in their grief.
Mm-hmm. And resisting the urge to follow that up with anything positive or silver lining-y, you know?
Yes, and which is so hard.
It's so interesting. And I feel like there's this misconception that, you know, if you acknowledge that something is really, really, really hard and really shitty, then you're going to make the person feel shittier. Right. You know, that's kind of what people think. But really, it's like, no, this is just shit. And all you're doing is you're acknowledging the truth, and you're putting yourself into that discomfort with me because I'm already there. So
Right.
it's really appreciated. This is one of my favorite ones, actually, is just people who are like, acknowledge the shittiness.
Mhm.
That to me was a huge one, especially from the very beginning.
Yeah, I agree totally.
Yeah. Okay, number 3 is you don't really have to say anything, like, as long as you show up. So the worst thing to do is say nothing at all, but that means like not doing anything, disappearing. So that's not what I'm saying. Like, you don't have to say the perfect thing. There's nothing you really need to say necessarily, but just showing up in a tangible way. So whether that means like, I'm going to go grocery shopping for you every Tuesday. This is a list of the staples that I'm going to get you. Let me know if you have any changes you want to make to this list. If not, I'm going to drop it off at 10 every Tuesday and just leave it on your doorstep. Or I'm going to take your kid to the park, or can I guess you should ask, it's a child. Can I take your child to the park every Friday at 1? I'll come pick them up and drop them off at 3 to give you some time to yourself. Like, let me know if that works for you. Really being specific and offering tangible things, or even just listening and, making it clear that you're like open to listening, obviously, but then you don't need to say any perfect thing. Just being there and bearing witness to it is magical and wonderful and amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best thing you can do. And I think the saying nothing and just acting is so powerful, especially if you were close enough with this person and like, okay, I'm just going to drop this off and ring your doorbell and leave. Like, I think kind of how this person responds and what they want and need. So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay. Number 4, call me anytime. I promise your grief is not too much for me. And again, I think this is one of just being able to sit in it with a person, but you have to mean it.
Yeah.
Like, you have to actually be able to handle the grief, and do not offer this if you aren't the kind of person that can truly sit in it. And if the grief is overwhelming, that's okay. Grief is overwhelming to a lot of people. Not everyone is meant to be that person that can sit and hear the pain from another person. And we all change at different points in our lives and day to day even. So I think if you are able to do it, that is so powerful to be like, you can call me at any time. I'm a person, you can call me at 3 a.m. I will listen. It's not a burden. It is not a burden. You are not a burden. Is just so impactful, because you feel like it's too much. You feel like your grief is too much for everyone. You can't talk about it. You can't feel it. You can't live it without being judged. And to have somebody say that, especially again in the early stages where I don't know what I'm doing or how I'm feeling or how to respond, and my friends are shifting and my relationships are shifting because of this grief, to be able to remind the person grieving that they can call you at any time and it's not a burden and it's not too much, is just really beautiful.
Yeah, that's a beautiful one. I love that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so number 5 is no need to respond ever. I'll keep reaching out, and then actually keep reaching out. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to grief is that if a griever doesn't respond to a bunch of your texts, or if they don't answer your calls, or they don't take you up on your offers to hang out, it means that you should stop trying. It means that you're bothering them. It means that you've done something to offend them and they need space from you. And I have dealt with this one a lot in my grief, because I became extremely I went inwards in my grief, and I really didn't socialize a lot for the first year, and still even don't very much. And so I've heard this one a lot, of people being like, oh, I thought I'd offended you and I figured I'd hurt you. And really having to remind people, like, please keep reaching out, even if I'm not always able to respond. Because at first I just couldn't. I couldn't respond to all the texts, and it was just too hard, and I didn't have the energy, and I was like dealing with a child, and it was a lot. And so I think this one it feels so, even now when people, I have friends still now at almost 2 years that always do this with me. Well, they'll write me a text and they'll say like, no need to respond. I will keep reaching out if I don't hear from you. And it's like, oh, I just love that so much. It's such a relief.
I mean, for me, I don't know if I knew how powerful this was until I had a friend say it. And I have one friend in particular, and she would text me regularly and be like, I'm just thinking about you. No need to respond. She would end everyone with, No need to respond. Just want you to know I'm thinking about you. And seeing that regularly from her and taking the pressure off of me just meant everything. Like it really did, because I did, every time a text message would come through, it would be like, oh my God, I have to respond. And if once I open this door, then I have to have a conversation, and then they're going to ask me to do something, and I don't know the direction this is going, and I can't handle it. So that kind of text message is so great. And like you said, keep doing it. Keep saying, keep checking in, keep texting, keep calling, and with no expectation. So, okay, number 6. This one's my favorite, and I think it's the best you can do personally for me, and that is share a story. So many people avoid talking about the person we lost. They avoid saying their name. And again, it goes back to, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable and remind you that your person's dead. And it's like, we remember they're dead. We know. We think about it all the time. Telling me how Brad impacted your life is such a joy. Telling me a silly joke, a story, a memory, like that's the greatest thing ever. So share all the stories, even years. Like I still want more stories. Share, keep sharing.
No, it's so good. It honors their life. It allows them to keep being alive and vibrant and changing for us, which is such a gift. It reminds us that other people are also still thinking of them and still holding them. Like they still have value in the world. Like there's just so many reasons why this is amazing. And like, why should we not I think about this so much. Like, why should we, because our person's died, like that's already hard enough. Then why should we also then not get to talk about them? Not get to share with them, right? Like that's just an extra burden on top of the burden already, which is that they're not physically here.
Right. And it is, I like, especially the further out I get, I've had a couple of people recently that sent me, that I haven't heard from, that I wasn't great friends with, that have sent me messages of just like, I've been thinking about Brad, and it just like, the idea that I'm not the only one, and I know I'm not the only one, but sometimes it feels that way, that I'm the only one carrying this grief and this memory, and it's on me to keep him alive. So to get that random check-in from someone being like, I'm thinking about Brad today, is so powerful and necessary, and I want that to continue for the rest of my life. Like I want people to bring him up for the rest of my life.
I'll keep bringing him up.
Okay. Okay, so those are what to say, what not to say. There's so many. I feel like we could have a second episode about this. And so I guess we should go. We have kind of some tips and takeaways to end this conversation with.
So the first one kind of circles us back to the very beginning of this episode, the way the episode started, which is acknowledge the loss. Just acknowledge it's there. It exists. It's a part of this person's life. It's a part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. Acknowledge it, and it just really puts us at ease and makes us feel comfortable and safe in that situation. And also it just takes a bit of the weight off. Once it's been acknowledged, just like, okay, it's been acknowledged. Now we kind of just have this understanding that this loss is a part of this dialogue, a part of your life, and we can continue on from there, with this acknowledgement made.
Yeah, I think that's great. The second one is to understand that everyone grieves differently. And so even though we're giving you all of these tips and tricks and what to do and not do, it's not always going to land the same for everyone. And so if it doesn't, don't stop trying. Keep showing up. Try something different. It's all about learning and understanding a person better. So saying the wrong thing is better than saying nothing. Showing up and saying the wrong thing is better than not showing up at all. So just keep moving forward and trying.
Mm-hmm. And then number 3 kind of nicely plays off of this, which is don't take it personally if what you say doesn't land. Try again. So inevitably, you are probably going to say something that is not going to land right. Grieving people are hurting, and there is no one size fits all for this. So there is probably going to be missteps and mistakes that happen. And I think this is what people really get hung up on. I think a lot of people get hung up on this one, is taking things personally. A lot of the time grieving people, they don't have as much of a filter as normally. And so might be a little bit just like, that that wasn't what I needed. Like, I didn't need that, or, okay, I can't do this right now. I can't have this conversation right now. And then if you take that really personally, I think that can really cause that wall to really come up, as opposed to just being like, okay, you know what? I don't know that much about grief. This is my first time trying this. It's hard. I'm going to keep trying. Maybe this didn't work for this person. I'll try something else,
Yeah, and that goes into the next one, number 4, which is when in doubt, ask the person. Early on, I wouldn't have known. I think being able to say, hey, is it helpful if I just check in? Is it helpful, or does it make you feel pressure if I text, a couple times a week? And it's give examples out there of how you can support them, maybe based on what you're capable of doing, and ask them what feels right, and know that's going to shift as they go through this grief process, and keep checking in and keep asking.
Yeah, I love that. I actually had one friend who did that with me this summer. She sent me this list. She was like, hey, I want to do one of these 5 things for you. Can you choose which one would be most helpful for you?
I love that. I love that.
Cook dinner for you every Thursday, help you research childcare options for D. Like, it was like this whole list, find you help you find a new therapist, like super helpful things that she knew I was struggling to do. And she was like, I want to really take one of these on. What would be most helpful for you right now?
Yeah.
I think she even said, if there's more than one, let me know. Like, it wasn't even choose one. It was I just remember being like, wow, you've put thought into this, and this is so cool. Because sometimes it is hard to just out of when someone says oh, what do you need from me? Sometimes it's hard to be like, I don't know what too much is. Is it too much to say what I really need is to be able to call you at 3 a.m. when I can't sleep and I'm freaking out? I don't know if that's what you want or you're capable of, right?
The list is such a great idea of things that you can actually follow through and offer. Because everyone is so different, like you said, of what they can actually offer and what's too much. So I love that idea.
Okay, number 5 is there is nothing that you can say that will take a griever's pain away. That is not the point of grief support. The worst thing that you can do is nothing at all. I think this is another huge one. People kind of fall into this trap of thinking okay, what I have to do here, Mira went through this huge loss. She's hurting so much. I'm going to be the one to make her feel better. I'm going to be the one to help her through that. And that's really problematic, because the point of grief support is not to lift somebody out of grief or to convince them that what happened to them isn't that bad. It's about sitting with them in the muck and acknowledging it's hard and understanding that there's literally nothing you can say that's going to take their pain away. And it's just about helping them, supporting them through that, making them feel less alone and less isolated, and just trying and showing up. That's really it, right?
Yeah. Show up. Just keep showing up. And so our 6th and final tip is that give your grieving person grace. Grief is really hard. We are not the best versions of ourselves. We're actually probably the worst versions of ourselves.
And for a long time.
For a long time. So please be patient and understanding and show up anyway, because it's fucking hard. Again, keep showing up, have grace and patience with the grieving people in your life.
Yeah. And one other thing that I just thought of, and maybe this is a nice way to end it. We never really talked about how we were going to end it. Is
you knew it would come.
Yeah, it would just happen. So something that I've been thinking about recently, because it's sometimes with these conversations around grief literacy, it feels oh my God, this is a lot of work. And what's the point of learning all of this? Oh my God. But I feel I don't know, for me, within my grief, for sure, all of these relationships in my life have been strained, absolutely. But I also feel certain relationships are really drawing closer, and the relationships that can be built within this type of a context, with this understanding of these types of tips and tricks, I think can just build such compassion. And it was interesting. This one woman who follows me on Instagram recently wrote me this DM, and it just really struck me. And she was like, I don't know how she found me somehow through something I wrote about parenting, but she's not anything to do with grief, and literally hadn't thought about grief at all. And she was like, everything you write, I just feel it's good advice for just being a human and connecting with other humans through life.
Yes, yes.
And like, that's the thing with all this stuff, right? It's like, yes, it becomes more obvious and apparent when there's a traumatic loss, like a bomb being dropped in the middle of a community of people. Yes, these things becomes so apparent that they're lacking. But even in a community where there isn't this huge bomb being dropped, like, these are all things that we can all benefit from and draw closer through understanding and practicing, because they are practice, right?
Yeah, and I think you're so right. I think what a beautiful sentiment, because we are just asking to sit and listen, to be in it with a person, to feel seen by a person, to try and see each other, and whether that's in grief or in something else in life, like the beautiful parts of life, then it really is about having that connection with another person on this human to human level. And I love that sentiment so much.
Yeah. And being better prepared and better equipped for when inevitably it's going to happen. Happening.
Yeah.
It's part of the human existence, and it's this part of the human existence that has been so ignored and overlooked.
Yeah.
And it would just serve us all so well to have more of an understanding and just more of a dialogue, more of a dialogue.
Yeah, you can't escape it, so might as well start practicing.
Yeah. A grief-literate society is a healthy society is the new one that I keep saying.
Love it. What a great tagline.
Okay, well, good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
I also keep being afraid that I'm gonna light my hair on fire because I have this candle.
I mean, it would make for a good show. I feel like we'd get lots of hits if you caught on fire.
A gift of this stupid grief is that I give way less shits about what people think of me now.
Zero fucks mentality.